avvio dalla sede del rettorato dell'Università di Verona, che è l'istituzione partner della SIS nella realizzazione del congresso. È un'occasione di reciproca soddisfazione per la SIS e per l'Ateneo Scaligero ospitare questo appuntamento importante sia dal punto di vista scientifico che dal punto di vista culturale. Do quindi con piacere la parola alla vice rettrice dell'Ateneo, professoressa Donata Gottardi, e di seguito alla presidente uscente del Comitato Unico di Garanzia, professoressa Alessandra Cordiano, per un breve saluto, e colgo l'occasione per anticipare i miei ringraziamenti a entrambe per il loro sostegno istituzionale e soprattutto umano nel lungo percorso di ideazione, organizzazione e realizzazione di questo congresso. Prego.
Grazie, un caro saluto a tutte e a tutti. Il rettore per un impegno istituzionale non potrà essere presente, mi ha chiesto di sostituirlo. Devo dire che porto con molto piacere i saluti dell'intero Ateneo a questa bellissima iniziativa da parte delle Storiche ed è quindi l'occasione di complimentarmi con voi. Di complimentarmi con voi per la vostra associazione innanzitutto, che mi colpisce molto nella scelta di un'associazione di storiche, per l'impegno organizzativo che ho conosciuto in parte, ma che ne ho capito tutta la complessità anche solo intervenendo in alcuni piccoli passaggi, e anche per la lunga attesa di poter tenere questo congresso che era stato immaginato qualche tempo fa e che poi è stato fermato a causa della pandemia. Per quanto sia ancora a distanza, la determinazione ad esserci, a organizzare e a avere questo congresso mi è sembrato molto così importante, e anche questo ha fatto parte della fatica di organizzare quando non sai nemmeno quando è il tempo in cui puoi organizzare un'iniziativa. E poi soprattutto per la molteplicità dei temi che affronterete nel corso di questo congresso. Non vi nascondo anche un po' di invidia per la capacità di capovolgere, a mio avviso, gli schemi, cioè di mettere al centro l'obiettivo di ragionare sulla storia di genere e attraverso percorsi, intrecci e prospettive, come dice il vostro titolo, attorno a questi ruotano come in un caleidoscopio che si ricompone e si arricchisce. Quindi il centro è la storia di genere e dentro ci sono tutta una serie di interessantissimi spunti lasciati molto liberi all'iniziativa anche di chi porta il suo sapere, porta le sue riflessioni. Quindi un grazie speciale alle organizzatrici di questa iniziativa, un grazie speciale da parte dell'Ateneo che vi ospita, sia pur virtualmente, per quanto riguarda tutte le relatrici che sono in parte, credo, già tutte collegate, per il lungo lavoro e un augurio di di ottimi risultati e della possibilità di lavorare assieme su questo tema importantissimo che è appunto la storia del genere. Grazie e auguri di buon lavoro a tutte e a tutti.
Grazie.
Grazie Marina, buongiorno a tutte, buongiorno a tutti, anche da parte mia un ringraziamento. Io porto i saluti del CUG uscente e di quello entrante, e direi forse che è stata una delle ultime iniziative che il CUG che ho avuto l'onore di presiedere ha patrocinato, ma sono certa che anche il CUG entrante proseguirà in questa strada, in particolare con il sostegno alla scuola estiva della SIS. È un onore, come ha già detto la prorettrice, per noi ospitare questo splendido evento in questa cornice così metaforica, anche spazialmente metaforica qual è appunto l'online, ma soprattutto dove appunto le questioni indagate sono così tante in un arco temporale cronologico così significativo e toccando contesti spaziali eterogenei e dove direi si può dire tutte le questioni femminili sono indagate con grande interesse. È un di particolare rilievo per me perché, come narravo prima alla prorettrice. Io, grazie proprio alla professoressa Garbellotti, anni fa ho partecipato a uno dei vostri eventi come relatrice. È stata un'esperienza straordinaria dove ho potuto apprezzare, ho un ricordo bellissimo di questo straordinario spessore dei temi e delle questioni. Ho un ricordo bellissimo della vivacità delle relazioni che si sono create e anche di questa comunità straordinaria come è appunto la SIS. Quindi per me è un onore, io vi ringrazio e vi auguro un buon lavoro. Io ascolterò con grandissimo piacere e arrivederci a tutte e a tutti. Grazie Marina.
Grazie a voi e cedo subito la parola alla Presidente della Società Italiana delle Storiche, Raffaella Sarti.
Grazie Marina. Buonasera, buon pomeriggio a tutte e a tutti. Sono molto felice di aprire questo congresso della Società Italiana delle Storiche dedicato alla storia di genere, percorsi, intrecci, prospettive. Si tratta dell'8º congresso della SIS. Il primo si tenne nel lontano 1995 in una situazione molto diversa. Ebbe sede a Rimini e tra un panel e l'altro era anche possibile fare un bagno e prendere il sole. Oggi ci troviamo invece online in uno spazio virtuale, una situazione inimmaginabile anche solo pochi anni fa. Anche questo congresso in effetti era stato programmato in presenza, come già è stato ricordato, come i 7 che lo avevano preceduto. La pandemia ci ha costretto a cambiare sede ma non programma. Siamo così passate alla sede virtuale da quella prevista reale presso l'Università di Verona, che comunque ci ospita e alla quale Università di Verona va il nostro ringraziamento, così come va un ringraziamento per il supporto al congresso, alla Libera Università di Bolzano e alla Giunta Centrale per gli Studi Storici. Porto in proposito i saluti del Presidente della Giunta, professor Andrea Giardina. Preparare un congresso online con più di 180 relatrici e relatori e 44 panel non è un'impresa facile. Il comitato scientifico e il comitato organizzatore hanno lavorato, direi, indefessamente, in particolare la professoressa Marina Garbellotti, coordinatrice dei comitati. Credo quindi che alla professoressa Garbellotti debba andare un sentito ringraziamento da parte di tutte e tutti noi. Se abbiamo affrontato le difficoltà di battere sentieri nuovi dal punto di vista organizzativo è perché siamo fortemente convinte dell'importanza del genere come chiave di lettura della realtà e dell'importanza del congresso e di tenere, nonostante tutto, il congresso in quanto momento di scambio, confronto e come un'occasione per dare visibilità alle tante ricerche relative a questo ambito di studi. Con un certo orgoglio devo dire che lo stesso Presidente della Repubblica, Sergio Mattarella, in un certo senso ha voluto condividere la convinzione dell'importanza di questo congresso e ci ha concesso la medaglia del Capo dello Stato, quindi un riconoscimento di cui gli siamo grate e di cui andiamo in un certo senso fiere. La stessa pandemia, peraltro, insomma, ha, se possibile, rafforzato la nostra convinzione dell'importanza di una lettura di genere della realtà e ugualmente ha rafforzato la nostra convinzione dell'importanza di tenere il congresso alla luce del fatto che la pandemia ha pesato e pesa in maniera differenziata sulle vite di donne e uomini, quindi mantenere alta l'attenzione sul tema del genere è fondamentale. Non a caso anche il Piano Nazionale di Ripresa e Resilienza pone la parità di genere tra i propri obiettivi prioritari, anche se poi le misure proposte non sempre paiono finora adeguate a raggiungere questo obiettivo. In questo senso è veramente fondamentale contribuire a diffondere una cultura del genere, a rendere le persone capaci di analizzare la realtà in un'ottica di genere. C'è un po' su questo un pregiudizio, visto che in qualche modo il genere riguarda tutti noi, tutte noi, le nostre vite, sembra qualcosa di semplice, di ovvio, banale, laddove invece è un tema estremamente complesso che per essere analizzato adeguatamente richiede strumenti raffinati e una grande sensibilità che è necessario sviluppare in una prospettiva storica, anche dal punto di vista evidentemente di storiche e storici professionisti, ma anche per una lettura corretta della realtà contemporanea. Per capire il presente serve valutare, essere in grado di valutare il peso della storia, la profondità delle radici storiche dei fenomeni con i quali ci confrontiamo, capire dove si collocano continuità e rotture e quindi da questo punto di vista è estremamente importante diffondere una sensibilità a queste tematiche in una prospettiva di genere e storica. In assenza di una cultura di questo genere c'è il rischio che in realtà in molti casi è concreto che l'enfatizzazione degli obiettivi in termini di parità di genere siano dei vuoti proclami, laddove invece è necessario accelerare, muoversi concretamente verso il raggiungimento di questo obiettivo, che è perseguibile solo se le differenze di genere sono riconosciute e il riconoscimento di queste differenze di genere è la premessa per una vera parità di genere. E da questo punto di vista, se per raggiungere questi obiettivi è necessario uno sguardo largo e inclusivo, il nostro congresso sicuramente rappresenta un esempio di grande apertura e inclusività, ferma restando la selezione delle proposte da parte del comitato scientifico su una base di appunto adeguatezza metodologica e storiografica. Le ricerche, basta scorrere il programma, le ricerche spaziano su una enorme vastità di temi, dalla storia delle donne alla critica del binarismo sessuale, i corpi, le percezioni di sé, soggettività, agire individuale, collettivo, politica, movimenti femministi, ecologisti, scritture, cinema, il sacro, le emozioni, temi coloniali, il lavoro, la propaganda politica, insomma ci sono le migrazioni, ci sono tantissimi temi che ricorrono in questo congresso che vuole essere un'arena di confronto e dibattito il più ampio e il più aperto possibile. Da questo punto di vista vediamo anche è anche un'arena in cui valutare lo stato dell'arte, vedere le stesse, parliamo di storia di genere, ma la storia di genere cambia nel corso degli anni, la nozione di genere viene declinata in maniera differenziata e per cogliere soggettività in un ambito sempre più vasto e inclusivo. In questo senso io mi auguro che questo convegno sia veramente un luogo di scambio e confronto a tutto tondo. Per questo abbiamo lavorato e ci auguriamo che il nostro impegno arrivi allo scopo che si prefiggeva. Auguro quindi a tutte e a tutte le persone che partecipano buon lavoro e ringrazio tutte e tutti coloro che hanno proposto dei panel, presenteranno dei paper, faranno da discussant, buon lavoro, e ringrazio altresì tutte e tutti coloro che ci seguiranno e vorranno partecipare con domande, discussioni, alle discussioni che si terranno. Per il momento mi fermo qui e lascio la parola a Marina Garbellotti, ringraziandola nuovamente a nome di tutta la Società delle Storiche, credo a nome di tutte le persone che partecipano al congresso, per il suo grandissimo impegno in questa complessa macchina organizzativa che è questo incontro online. Grazie.
Grazie, come vi dicevo in apertura, io sono davvero molto onorata di essere qui con voi e con quanti e quanti ci seguiranno nei lavori dei prossimi giorni. È già stato detto, ma non posso non ripeterlo, perché davvero considero il congresso della SIS, che viene promosso ogni 4 anni, un luogo di confronto speciale. È vero che è promosso dalla SIS, ma è aperto a tutte le studiose e gli studiosi che hanno l'opportunità quindi di presentare il lavoro di ricerca e di partecipare alle discussioni comuni. I tratti distintivi del congresso sono principalmente la sua valenza fortemente interdisciplinare, l'ampio contesto geografico e la prospettiva diacronica. I congressi della SIS annullano gli steccati disciplinari, spaziali e temporali. Questi elementi costituiscono, a mio avviso, già di per sé un'importante lezione di metodo, ma vi è di più. Le tematiche trattate, oltre a indicare nuove direzioni di ricerca, hanno anche la capacità di promuovere e valorizzare la cultura delle differenze. Quindi gli interventi che ci apprestiamo a seguire sono significativi per il loro portato scientifico, ma anche per l'impegno civile che trasmettono. Selezionare le proposte di panel è stata un'operazione complessa, per certi versi anche sofferta, perché le proposte sono state davvero molto numerose e ringrazio le componenti del comitato scientifico per il costante e generoso impegno che hanno profuso in questo compito non semplice. Nella costruzione del programma ci siamo proposti di rispettare la vocazione dei congressi SIS, cioè di offrire un panorama della storia delle donne di genere e anche di dare spazio alle emergenti prospettive di indagine, sempre in un'ottica pluridisciplinare e di lunga durata. Non ripeto i molti temi che sono già stati indicati, basta sfogliare il programma, anche virtuale, per capire quanto sia ricco e fitto di incontri il congresso. Mi preme però dire che ponderare le varie esigenze scientifiche nella composizione del programma ha comportato un notevole sforzo di equilibrio e ci spiace molto di non aver potuto accogliere altri panel. Quando credo ormai 3 anni fa, lo ricordava in apertura la prorettrice, nel direttivo della SIS si è cominciato a discutere del luogo, della città, dell'università dove realizzare l'8º congresso, ho proposto la candidatura, una risposta positiva da parte dell'Ateneo. Desidero quindi ringraziare il magnifico rettore dell'Università di Verona, professor Pierfrancesco Nocini, la prorettrice, professoressa Donata Gottardi, e la delegata alla comunicazione, professoressa Nicoletta Zerman, che dal primo colloquio hanno accolto con entusiasmo la proposta di tenere l'8º congresso SIS in presenza. Allora la parola Covid-19 non era ancora entrata nel nostro vocabolario. E questo entusiasmo non è venuto meno, non si è spento nel momento in cui le circostanze ci hanno imposto la modalità online. Questo convinto appoggio ha dimostrato ancora una volta la volontà dell'Ateneo Scaligero di favorire la ricerca scientifica nelle sue molteplici declinazioni e la sua attenzione per la cultura di genere. Organizzare il congresso online ha rappresentato anche una sfida organizzativa e un supporto aggiuntivo di prestazioni e di risorse da parte dell'Ateneo, che non è mai venuto meno. Ringrazio quindi il comitato organizzatore, Alessandra Cordiano in qualità di presidente del comitato unico di garanzia, il direttore del Dipartimento di Cultura e Civiltà, al quale afferisco, professor Leonardo Soldani, il direttore del Dipartimento di Scienze Giuridiche, il professor Stefano Troiano, e il direttore del Dipartimento di Scienze Umane, professor Riccardo Panattoni, per la loro fattiva collaborazione e per il loro generoso supporto. Anche altre istituzioni hanno creduto nella portata storiografica di questa iniziativa, dando il loro pieno sostegno. Quindi esprimo anch'io la mia gratitudine per il presidente della Giunta Centrale per gli Studi Storici, professor Andrea Giardina, e per la Libera Università degli Studi di Bolzano. CGIL regionale del Veneto, SPI CGIL Veneto, IVRES hanno dato il loro sostegno alla sessione plenaria per non essere mai più sole contro la violenza sessuale, una pagina storica delle donne di Verona negli anni 70, che si terrà in presenza il 22 ottobre. E quindi questa sarà un'altra occasione per rivedersi, auguriamoci in presenza. Organizzare il congresso in collaborazione con l'Ateneo mi ha permesso nuovamente di confrontarmi col personale delle direzioni di Ateneo e i loro dirigenti e come sempre ho trovato persone competenti e collaborative. Vorrei ricordare l'area comunicazione e la direzione sistemi informativi e tecnologie, con la quale per ovvie ragioni sono stata in costante comunicazione, e in particolare la dottoressa Olga Forlani, che ringrazio per il costante supporto e per la molta pazienza dimostrata nei miei confronti, e la dottoressa Chiara Antonioli per la splendida grafica del programma. Mi piace poter affermare, e qui chiudo, che il congresso è l'esito di un lavoro corale. Grazie e passo la parola alla professoressa Satti, la Presidente della Società Italiana delle Storiche.
Grazie mille. Riprendo la parola per introdurre questa prima sessione che è inaugurata dalla professoressa Joanna De Groot, che ringraziamo di aver accettato il nostro invito. Thank you, Joanna, for accepting our invitation. Il congresso è aperto da Joanna De Groot, quindi, che è una nota iranista dell'Università di York nel Regno Unito. Joanna si occupa di storia di genere, di storia delle donne, ha lavorato appunto sulla storia dei ruoli di genere dal XVIII secolo in poi, in una serie diversa di contesti, in particolare nel mondo medio orientale, ma anche nell'ambito del mondo anglosassone. Si è occupata di pensiero e politica razziale europea, di nazionalismo iraniano, di movimenti radicali, di pratiche relative all'uso del velo, alla storia della sessualità e dell'omosessualità. È molto attenta anche a questioni concettuali e metodologiche, e ha sviluppato da questo punto di vista una particolare sensibilità e attenzione alla storia di genere nel contesto dell'imperialismo britannico, con un taglio comparato, e quindi con un'attenzione anche alle dimensioni globali di di queste vicende storiografiche. Mi piace ricordare il suo libro Religion, Culture and Politics in Iran del 2007. Joanna aprirà il congresso con una prolusione intitolata The Space of Gender and the Gender of Space, Some Thought from an Historian of 19th Century Iran, che è disponibile anche in traduzione italiana. Nella chat verrà indicato il link da cui può essere scaricata la sua relazione. Questa relazione è anche pubblicata come anteprima della pubblicazione sul prossimo numero di Genesis del giugno 2021 sulla una pagina della casa editrice Viella, di cui pure ora vi mandiamo in chat il link. Da questo punto di vista ringrazio anche Ida Fazio e tutta la redazione di Genesis per il fatto di accogliere questa pubblicazione, tra l'altro di farlo come pubblicazione in open access. La scelta di queste tematiche relative alla storia dell'Iran è legata alla volontà di recare un omaggio da parte della SIS alla memoria di Anna Vanzan, iranista, componente del direttivo della società dal 2014 al 2018, della redazione di Genesis dal 2018 in poi, che faceva parte anche del comitato scientifico del congresso, che purtroppo è prematuramente scomparsa il 24 dicembre del 2020. Anna è stata una studiosa estremamente sensibile, con un complesso percorso intellettuale caratterizzato da una continua un continuo impegno contro le banalizzazioni e gli stereotipi, caratteristica che per certi versi la accomuna a Joanna, come sentirete anche ascoltando la sua prolusione. Stereotipi e banalizzazioni che sono così frequenti nel modo in cui la cultura e il mondo islamico sono presenti e descritti in Italia e più in generale nel mondo occidentale. Non a caso Anna spesso utilizzava parole come Islam o locuzioni come femminismo islamico, proprio tra virgolette, nella piena consapevolezza del fatto che potessero essere delle etichette banalizzanti, che semplificavano una realtà di cui invece Anna voleva cogliere tutte le sfaccettature. Anna è stata una storica raffinata e si è impegnata molto tuttavia anche sul fronte della traduzione, con una grande attenzione alle parole, alla loro pregnanza, e grazie a questa sua attività di traduzione il pubblico italiano ha potuto entrare in contatto e conoscere tante opere della letteratura persiana e farsi anche un'idea della loro ricchezza. La curiosità intellettuale di Anna l'ha portata a occuparsi di una grande varietà di temi, seppur legati gli uni agli altri: la cultura persiana di cui era innamorata, le donne in questo mondo, le donne dell'Islam nell'immaginario italiano, le figlie di Sherazad, le donne ai giardini islamici, le donne di Allah, le donne protagoniste delle primavere rosa, le donne iraniane tra storia, politica e cultura. In tutta nella sua prospettiva di ricerca il genere ha svolto un ruolo importante che l'ha portata anche a Queering Islam, cioè, per citare il titolo di un suo saggio, quindi indagando il mondo omosessuale, queer e transessuale nell'ambito islamico, su cui ha scritto con Yolanda Guardi. Quindi Anna ha avuto una produzione intellettuale estremamente ricca, con uno sguardo ampio, internazionale, che ha avuto numerosi riconoscimenti sia in Italia che all'estero. E tuttavia appunto in Italia l'Accademia italiana forse non le ha dato tutti i riconoscimenti che si sarebbe meritata, tema che ci riporta un po' anche alle questioni sollecitate nel mio intervento precedente sulla necessità di un riconoscimento pieno dell'importanza e della rilevanza degli studi di genere, sia dal punto di vista della loro rilevanza, come diceva Marina Garbellotti, civile, sia della loro rilevanza più specificamente legata al mondo accademico. Da questo punto di vista, insomma, per l'affetto che portiamo ad Anna e alla sua memoria, abbiamo voluto dedicarle ha voluto aprire il convegno con un intervento sulla storia dell'Iran che tanto amava, con tutte le sue contraddizioni. Su questo ringraziamo anche la figlia di Anna, Maria Vittoria Paladin, che ci ha aiutato a preparare una breve presentazione della figura, dell'immagine, della figura di sua madre, Anna Vazzano. Permettetemi quindi ora di condividere con voi questa presentazione.
قصه داره آلبالو و پسته داره پشت خنده ها یه گرمش آدمای خسته داره خونه جاش تو بازی داره گربه های نازی داره خونه ما گرم و صمیمی رو دیواراش عکسای قدیمی عکس بازی توی ایوون لب دریا تو تابستون عکس اون رو زیر بارون با یه بغضای چمدون رفتن از پیش آدمای نازنین مهربون.
Bene, grazie. A questo punto lascio con grande piacere la parola a Joanna De Groot per la sua previsione che appunto tratta dello spazio di genere e spazio. Come ho già preannunciato, esiste per chi non è familiare con l'inglese la traduzione disponibile e quindi lascio subito la parola a Joanna. Thank you again, Joanna, for your keynote. Thank you.
Allora, buonasera, buongiorno e saluti a tutti. I apologize that I don't speak Italian, and I will try and speak as clearly as possible in my own language. And you don't have to be stuck with my face because I am about to share a screen so that I can illustrate my talk. So it's a great pleasure to speak to your conference and to pay my own tribute to Anna van Zan, whose work I have long valued. And there is another gorgeous picture. That was a lovely memorial collection, by the way. My lecture will bring the interest in histories of women and of gender in Iran, which I share with Anna, into wider conversations about the importance of spatial elements in gender and women's history, and the importance of women and gender as essential categories for the exploration of spatial history. In the third decade of the 21st century, historians of women and gender are well aware of the importance of what we call in English decolonization, whereby we seek to unpack and challenge monolithic, ethnocentric, and exclusionary practices in our research and writing. Anna's commitment to linking her expertise on Iran to the wider domain of women's and gender history and to issues of migration and ethnic diversity in Italy today is exemplary in this respect. I want to honor and follow her example by beginning my talk with a discussion of women's and gender historians' engagements with spatial issues and make that a basis for my reflections on women, gender, and space in 19th century Iran. In the spirit of decolonization, I will foreground a range of global material and situate that material in the context of global exchanges and power relations, from ancient Greek diasporas and the so-called Crusades to the Atlantic trade in enslaved people and histories of European exploration and colonialism since 1500. In the spirit of current feminist thinking, I will take an intersectional approach to my general discussion of gender and space, and to my consideration of spatial approaches to histories of women and gender in Iran. Over the last half century, practitioners of women's and gender history have researched and theorized the role of spatial elements and influences on sex and gender, and have critiqued gender-blind practices in disciplines like geography, history, and sociology when considering issues of space. A few exemplary images will give some idea of the impact of this work and the rich variety of aspects of gender space. Early modern depictions of Italian women in urban marketplaces remind us of the complexities of gendered practice in urban centres, where women were both traders and consumers and moved between households, farms, and workshops and urban commercial spaces. In Dominica, in the Caribbean, the presence of women of African, European, and mixed descent, both free and enslaved, together in the markets of the Caribbean, demonstrate multiple spatial intersections involving local commercial activity and the transatlantic trade in enslaved people, which sustained European colonialism. Other gendered cross-cultural and colonial spatial relations emerged from the missionary activities which helped to constitute those relationships across and within social, physical, and cultural spaces. Migrant nuns schooling Polynesian pupils in 19th century Hawaii, like counterparts in 17th century Peru or 20th century Africa, enacted powerful, unequal, and gendered relations of adult and child, colonial superiors and subordinates, Christian and non-Christian, within and across spaces. In globalized variants of the trade in sexual services, we see here Dutch and Japanese merchants in Deshima, the designated point for Dutch-Japanese contacts in Japan, socializing with local women sex workers and servants of Indo-Muslim backgrounds brought by the Dutch from their Indonesian empire. This encounter, recorded by a Japanese artist, came out of Japanese state policy, Dutch commercial and colonial interests, and the cultural conventions combining sexualized entertainment with a formal social exchange. This is celebrating the birthday of the Netherlands monarch. We can explore the movements of participants through cultural, social, and physical spaces as male agents of trade and diplomacy, or of subordinate female entertainers and sex workers and servants, all negotiating linguistic and cultural differences, as well as unequal power relations. Turning to consider images of ancient Greek women wool workers and of 18th century weavers in India, we can reflect on the gendered, classed, and global elements shaping the spaces of female labor. This might happen in household spaces where work, family, and household and social life intersected. It might be associated with ritual or religious spaces, as in ancient Greece or medieval Western Europe, or with global links to raw materials, markets, and investment, as in 18th century India or the 19th century Southern USA. It might involve spatial interaction between men and women, or the separation of women's workspaces from those of men, involving contests over the control of those practices by state, faith, or community, and slippages between different practices. In all cases, spatial elements intersected with political, material, and cultural discourses and practices. So the image of women wool workers on an ancient Greek vase is shadowed by the myth of Penelope, enacting her elite women's role as a virtuous wife, defending her household and her marriage while she weaves cloth, just as her husband, Odysseus, moves through the spaces of male heroic achievement. The practical and cultural significance of ancient Greek women's activities as textile producers had spatial aspects from ritual dedication and collection in temples to the spaces occupied by weavers and looms. The portrayal of women in Dominica by the Italian-English painter Agostino Brunias presented complex intersections of great race, gender, and enslavement, which underpinned the lives of traders, wives, and servants or slaves, while also offering a racialized and exoticized European perspective on those lives for European buyers or viewers of his art. These briefly described visual materials suggest complex potential for spatial approaches to women's history, which has been identified in work by historians of women and gender and by social, cultural, and spatial historians who have heeded that work. Gendered and spatialized constructions of ethnicity and war, developed during the so-called Crusades, brought Western Europeans to the Eastern Mediterranean as warriors, settlers, pilgrims, and rulers, and reconfigured travel, social structures, personal relations, and cultural practices in both Western Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. And I'll compare that very briefly with the powerful links between gender and the mutually constitutive ritual and social structure of the ancient Greek polis, which were manifest spatially in sacred sites within settlements and on the border of the polis, the organization of rituals undertaken by women and men at those sites, and movements within the polis to the boundaries, to the cities and the shrines. In a different period, the work of Burguera on confrontations between peasant and urban interests in and around 19th century Valencia shows that both gender and class contributed to the formation and enactment of relations between rural and urban spaces involving female vegetable traders, young male manure gatherers, city residents, and regulators. So we're all aware, I think, that this is the product, all this work, of significant conceptual and methodological efforts, as well as empirical research, to which historians of women and gender have made transformative contributions. And I'll just pick up 2 or 3 themes before I move into the main body of my talk. So firstly, the discussion of patriarchy and its relation to public and private spheres. We might note particularly the debate with Habermas's rather gender-blind account of the development of the public sphere, which has deconstructed and critiqued notions of public, private patriarchy, but not necessarily got rid of them, leading to a much more complex and reflective use of those terms, and sometimes a moving away from them. The other main theme, I think, is the gendered critique of urban history and historical geography, which in the first instance recuperates the presence of women in various spaces, recuperates their agency, and then goes on to challenge the boundaries of inside out, outside, street and home, fields and houses, and so on. And again, perhaps a move we can see in our own immediate present to a much more fluid, relationally based, and intersectional approach to those themes. So what I want to do now is to acknowledge how, as someone working on gendered histories of 19th century Iran, I value this decentered, interactive practice of gendered spatial history, or spatialized gender history, which enable me now to turn to consider how this rich body of work on gender and space has supported my own explorations of women and gender in the 19th century Iran. And I begin with 2 stories. Firstly, between July and September 1852, the British resident, a senior diplomatic and commercial official in Bushehr on the Gulf, the British ambassador in Tehran, and British officials in India were in correspondence about a range of issues raised by the conversion of an Armenian woman known as Karapet, it's a surname, not a first name, and her son to Shia Islam. While there are gaps in the story, which is of course filtered through the partial and value-laden views of male British diplomats, we can identify some interesting themes. The story is anchored in varied and intersecting spaces. In geographical terms, the woman in the story may have had connections to the major regional capital of Esfahan in central Iran, had been married in Bombay, in India, and in the 1850s was a resident of Bushehr, an important port city on the Gulf. Her original husband and his relatives may well have moved to Bushehr from British rule India or perhaps from Esfahan as part of their work for the British. In terms of social spaces, these geographical movements embedded the woman and her family within the Armenian community in Bushire and possibly earlier in Isfahan, communities which were distinct but not wholly separate from Muslim neighbors. It also embedded some of her relatives in the physically, socially, and legally separate space of the British residency as employees of the British. This involved gender distinctions between the workspaces used by those men involved in commercial and diplomatic transactions and household or neighborhood spaces in which women as well as men operated. The proximity of Armenian and Muslim residents in the woman's neighborhood is indicated by the development of a relationship between Karapet and a Muslim man with whom she began to cohabit, causing concern among her neighbors, including in the Armenian case, relatives. Spaces of work and residence were, of course, also gendered culturally, and movement across religious spaces arising from the conversion of the Armenian woman and her son to Shia Islam, which was the majority faith in 19th century Iran, had familial, religious, and communal significance. The contest between the mother, Karapet, the relatives, and British and Iranian officials over the conversion of her teenage son concerned his position inside or outside family space, where and with whom should he live, as well as his position in religious space, the activities of particular faith groups. It also linked kinship, work, gender, and legal status, since the key issue for the British officials was the status of mother and or son as converts, but more importantly, as potential British subjects, or at least persons entitled to British protected status, a status arising from those work relationships, male relatives to the British. Another powerfully gendered spatial consideration in this story relates to sex and marriage. According to the British account, Karapet separated from her husband and went to live with a Muslim man, and then later sought to convert to Islam and to claim what they call his protection, possibly indicating some formal marital relationship, but also was persuading her son to convert with promises of a wife and money. This allowed neighbors, relatives, and British officials to label her, quote, a woman of bad character, leading a disreputable life, also a quote, whose decision to change faith was provoked by reproaches, presumably from neighbors and relatives, about her so-called immoral conduct. It also raised issues of divorce, separation, and under whose protection, brackets male, Karapet could or should be living. The moralized spatial question of her place in a household, a marriage, or a kin group, or the sphere of British legal and diplomatic protection, were shaped by gendered codes of sexual and marital conduct and status. Although not fully articulated in the source, there are hints of a clash between British understandings of husbandly protection, divorce and separation, and the rather different practices of Iranians. This latter can be seen in the distinction made between Karapet's, quote, cohabitation with a Muslim man and her seeking his, quote, protection in conjunction with her change of faith. These combined a social and physical shift into another household space with a new partner on new terms, with entry into a different religious space. The gender dynamic of that space was also manifest in contests over the custody of Karapet's teenage son, whose legal and communal position and future was far more a concern to the British than the situation of his mother, adding another gendered dynamic. The other spatial variable in the maneuvers around Karapet's situation, recorded by the British, was the imperial context in which these British officials pursued Karapet's case. The resident in Bushire took up the issue with British colleagues in the Iranian capital, Tehran, but also colleagues in the British governmental hub in Bombay. This signaled how British presence in Iran was part of a transation and transnational web of interests and activities supported by and supporting commercial and imperial interests in India and reliant on relationships with Indians, Iranians, and other locals. From high-level involvement with rulers and elites to the employment of Indian and Iranian clerks, soldiers, interpreters, and manual workers, the British imperial project relied on its spatial agility and connections to sustain work and power. British officials dealt with high officials in the Iranian government who claimed the Karapets as Iranian subjects from the long-established Armenian community in Esfahan, demonstrating a modern grasp of legal notions of the subject and also of record keeping, which allowed them to reference an urban census. Equally, the Brits were dealing with local employees and their families, claiming British protection on the basis of their work for the British or their kinship to male employees and or their origins in British-ruled India. On the one hand, imperial effectiveness depended on the ability to use and manage the relationships on which empire depended within and across local, regional, and transnational space. On the other hand, local people and communities had to manage the powerful presence and views of the British, whether over legal and physical control over employees or about conversion and freedom of religion. This individual story illustrates the rich potential of an approach to spatial histories of 19th century Iran, focusing on their complex, interactive, and fluid features, linking a small urban ethno-religious community, the Armenians were quite a small minority in Iran, and a particular woman's family to global networks and influences. The power of communal opinion, of transnational religious customs, values, and practices, and of state and imperial interests was offset by Karapet's personal agency in renegotiating her religious affiliation, her sexual situation, and her place of residence. Having taken the initiative to separate from her husband and leave his, quote, protection to live with someone else, when confronted by communal criticism, she took steps to strengthen her position by confirming publicly her change of protector and deciding on conversion and that of her son. While these decisions were shaped by the constraints imposed by unequal power relation, women's need for male protectors, the power of communal moral judgments, they show Karapet seeking solutions to her situation, using her capacity to offer sexual and personal partnership, and resisting attempts to make her change her mind. As much recent scholarship on spatial history argues, individuals and groups make, contest, control, and negotiate spaces, shaping through relationships and through movement, as well as by using material, cultural, legal, or political resources. The second personal history, which I read in spatial terms, concerns an episode of marital crisis in an elite family in the capital of Iran, a generation after Karapet's encounter with her neighbors and British officials. This crisis is related in an autobiographical postscript to a political text on women and marriage written in 1894-5 by a woman called Bibi Khanum Astarabadi, a pro-woman author and later reforming activist in the field of girls' education. Bibi Khanum recounts how 9 years into her marriage, she confronted difficulties as a mother and explored the possibility of her husband taking a second sigé wife. Sigé wives are temporary wives, as both a potential sexual partner and an additional domestic worker. Bibi Khanum then had to deal with problems which arose in consequence of putting that change into practice, including a tempestuous visit from the woman from whose household the sigé wife called Banu had come, leading Bibi Khanum to leave her own house and husband and take up residence with relatives. After arguments and negotiations with her husband, she returned to the marital home and resumed affectionate relations with him, shortly after which the sigé wife returned to the household from which she had come. I will comment on the spatial dynamics of this narrative under headings similar to those that I used for the spatial analysis of Karapet's story. I will highlight ways in which spatial analysis challenges oversimplified and orientalizing assumptions which still underpin much discussion of women in 19th century Iran, as elsewhere in the Middle East, as they also underpinned Iranian reforming discourses about the backwardness of women, so-called backwardness. Such discussions emphasize the segregation and seclusion of women as the principal determining features in their lives and as constitutive of their inequality, subordination. In a society where women's access to formal education, to public political roles, and to many occupations and activities was significantly restricted by socio-cultural codes of gender separation and male privilege, such an emphasis is understandable. However, closer consideration on women's lives and of gender dynamics in 19th century Iran reveals a much more complex picture, requiring an intersectional approach. The exclusions just described from various areas of business, politics, religion, and so on, were affected not only by gender, but by class and status, by location and occupation, and also by female agency resisting or negotiating with them. As will be shown in the discussion of Bibi Khanum's story and of some more general material to which I'll come later, the spatial dynamics of 19th century Iranian women's lives were rich, relational, and contested, as well as unequal. In physical terms, that story challenges any simplistic notion of women's confinement. Bibi Khanum calls herself an Astarabadi girl, identifying her connections with the capital of the province of Mazandaran in northern Iran, from where her family, with its connections to the military, the ulama, religious specialists, and the royal court, had moved to Tehran. Her husband was from a family which had moved from the Caucasus, from Karabakh in the Caucasus, to Tehran following the early 19th century Russian conquests there. There's another global story lurking to be talked about. Nor were women's movements through geographical space shaped only by their family situation. The girl whose contested position as the Sige wife is at the core of the story was brought from Rasht in northern Iran by a widow to work in Tehran and left that household for another when dissatisfied with her situation, before joining that of Bibi Khanum. Both Bibi Khanum and her mother, Khadija Khanum, moved between the family quarters, the underroon of the royal household, where Khadija Khanum had lived and worked as a tutor, and family homes. Khadija also moved between houses in Tehran and in Mazandaran province, as well as going as a pilgrim to Kabbalah in what we now call Iraq, where she subsequently lived away from her family. Later in life, Bibi Khanum herself would move between her family home and the premises where she ran a school. As conflict over Banu, the girl from Rasht, developed, her former mistress pushes into Bibi's house to seize Banu. While framed by conventions which based women within households and emphasized male authority and protection, when Bibi leaves her husband, she goes to an uncle's house. Her mother persuades her brother to take her to Kabbalah when she wants to get away from her house. It was possible for women to manage and manipulate these spatial conventions in pursuit of their own agenda. They might spend much time within the physical space of a household, but also move through space to other locations, which they might enter as employers, as clients, as teachers, or as servants, not just kin or spouses. As emerges in this last point, the spaces used, occupied, or created by Iranian women had gendered, socio-cultural, as well as physical or geographical features. Most obviously, it is unhelpful to see the households which were central to women's lives as simply, quote, domestic spaces when they were sites of productive, creative and service work, as well as of social networking among neighbours, patrons and clients, with all those political and cultural meanings. The peasant girl who entered Bibi Khanum's house sought work and security. Bibi's educated mother worked as a mulabashi, a tutor in the royal household, creating professional and patronage connections used by both mother and daughter, as when the latter stayed in the royal Andorun during her dispute with her husband. The marriage of Khadija Khanum was arranged by patrons at the royal court, not by kin. And Bibi used her own household space to host religious gatherings and to start a school. And she used the households of others to negotiate a reconciliation with her husband. The lives of these two women confirm evidence from many sources which show women entering households as traders, as domestic workers, as midwives, as skilled craft workers, as carers, and as entertainers, as well as visitors seeking sociable contact or pursuing conflict, as with the quarrel over Banu, the girl from Rasht. Indeed, proper consideration even of the limited and uneven evidence about the lives of 19th century Iranian women challenge us to revisit assumptions about the confining and, quote, domestic character of household space and its complex gender dynamics. In Bibi Khanum's story alone, we can see houses as spaces where women most move in and out, where they undertake paid work as well as caring for children, and are spaces which can be invaded, and where women negotiate over marital, sexual, and household arrangements. These activities were shaped by class and age, as well as gender, requiring us to take an intersectional approach. Banu, the Rashti rural girl, moves through space as a migrant and a protege of the widow who brought her to Tehran, as an asset whose sexual and domestic services are traded by other women, as a domestic worker, and as the sexual partner and possible sige wife of several men. Class relations and material transactions among women, as well as between women and men, and indeed between adults and children, made the Andorruns of elite households far more than sites of segregation, seclusion, and subordination of women. In the royal palace, they were a major part of the politics and culture of the ruling dynasty and its court, just as the home of Bibi Khanum's family might be the location for neighbors' quarrels and religious rituals. The uses and perceptions of Andorrun space in more advantaged households interacted with those of the Birun, the outer household space, where men undertook social, political, and cultural activities, rather than just operating in dualistic opposition to one another. And I here show a number of pictures, which I shall be talking about, of households where all sorts of things are going on and where inside and outside are more complex than might at first appear. The moment when Bibi Khanum and her husband struggle physically with the female visitor who storms into the house to take back Banu illustrates just such an interaction between the Birun and the Andorrun. It also signals the complex and not always binary spatial intersections of femininity and masculinity among 19th century Iranians. These are more usefully explored in terms of permeable boundaries and as nodes for both female and male networks extending beyond individual households. As I have discussed elsewhere, masculinities were formed and enacted in the household as well as in other spaces, streets, bazaars, and seminaries or tea houses. Similarly, femininities could be made and expressed in bathhouses, in shrines, and in workplaces, and in Bibi Khanum's case, the cultural space of authorship, and later in her life in schoolrooms, as well as in so-called domestic space. So Bibi Khanum's narrative, disadvantages, challenges, and constraints faced by elite women in spaces defined by gendered and class patterns of kinship, domesticity, sexual intimacy, and marriage, which indeed supported male, query patriarchal privilege. It also reveals the existence of various opportunities for women to exert their own agency in resisting or managing such constraints and disadvantages. The poor migrant girl maneuvering between households and relationships to make use of her work skills and sexual potential, like Bibi and Khadija moving across religious and cultural spaces to renegotiate marriage and motherhood, to exercise the skills of reading and writing and teaching, deployed skill and energy to protect their interests and meet their needs. They also deployed intersectional identities, with Banu slipping between employee, protege, carer, peasant, sexual partner, and rival and wife, just as Bibi Khanum slipped between wife, mother, patron, writer, and cultured woman, employer, or an older woman with a younger sexual rival in her marital household space. If Banu contested conventions of female covering and transgressed bodily and social spaces by not wearing her veil in the presence of non-related men, Bibi Khanum maneuvered in spaces controlled by kin and patrons to re-establish her marriage and move forward into feminist activism. She challenged women's cultural exclusion by becoming an author. Underpinning her work with both the education she obtained in the Royal Andorun and the support of female friends and networks. Deploying her grasp of the cultural spaces of classical poetry in Persian, the Quran, and of the colourful and bawdy vernacular language of Tehranis, her tract, called The Vices of Men, speaks back to a misogynist text called The Education of Women, which had been published in the late 1880s and is in fact a catalogue of negative stereotypes of women. Bibi Khanum's text mobilizes literary skill, popular argot, and polemical energy to confront the Education of Women text with its critique of male misconduct, locating the author's own efforts within the space of female networks, reading and reacting to the male text. So these two stories of Karapet and Bibi Khanum open up insights and questions about how to develop gendered spatial analyses of the lives of 19th century Iranians. Gendered spaces, I hope I've shown, need to be explored intersectionally and need to be understood as interactive and relational, considering movement, liminality, and mutually constitutive processes. The challenge for historians is to recognize the restrictive dynamic of many women's lives in workspaces, in streets, even in their homes, and their exclusion from key areas of religious, entrepreneurial, educational, and governmental space, while also recognizing their agency and their ability to manage the effects of unequal power. I will end my discussion by linking the insights provided by the two narratives to more wide-ranging points about gender and space in 19th century Iran. And I'll quickly here ask you to look at these different images of what might be called home and household and community. We've got social gatherings, an elite gathering around a samovar on the top left, a wonderful painting which is in the Victoria and Albert Museum in England. We have pictures of women of the Bakhtiari group posed outside a building, but then also moving about outside and near tents. We have a picture of much poorer rural people outside a hut with their water. We have men and women together in a village ritual on the left, on the bottom left. We have them clustered around a heating charcoal stove covered by cloth in a modest urban household. And we have elite women out picnicking as well. So what I wanted to convey here was all sorts of thoughts about permeability, about inside and outside not being lines in the way that old-fashioned ideas of house and public and private used to be. Women's productive contributions to life in 19th century also involved complex arrangements to space, relationships to space. So-called household work, such as processing food, making clothes, creating products from milk products and textiles for sale, involved movement within and between outdoor and indoor spaces. And you can see some of that here. An entertainer, some women preparing food, a woman selling baskets, women making bread, women involved in a farm, and then two women producing carpets. So movement between indoor and outdoor spaces, whether among the flocks and tents of pastoralists or mobile pastoralists or the fields and houses of rural settlements. Women's work also linked spaces ranging from the production of goods from nearby markets to activity as skilled carpet makers who by the 1870s were using their skills, high-level skills, imported capital and raw material, as well as local resources and household labor to create carpets for global export markets. And there's a whole good spatial story one can tell around the carpet industry. This last activity spatialized relations of household production to waged workshop weaving and international market forces, which operated through, but also modified established workplace practices. Women producers might also be training girls, like the men who managed family labor in the home or contracted for its products with external investors, patrons, or buyers. So moving from spaces which were very personal and intimate to global and distant and unequal. We have seen how Anderun space, while in part a matter of gender separation, which defined it as other, in contrast to the household birun and to external spaces, was a permeable space with outward facing as well as inward facing features and practices. These scenes that I'm showing you here also speak to that theme. Similar themes occur when we look at the gendering of outdoor urban space. Conventional narratives of gender inequity in the 19th century in Iran stress the exclusion and or segregation of women from so-called public urban spaces. A more revealing approach shows women as here, out shopping at the butcher's shop or in a big market space, in a rather posh textile store, or as poor women gathering and carrying water or going to the bath. So these records show women shopping in urban bazaars, visiting baths and religious premises, going through streets en route to social visits. They might adopt distinctive garments, they might keep their distance from men, use different parts of the facilities or enter them at different times. But it might be more useful to reflect on how women used and managed urban space than to accept the discourse of so-called male invisibility. So, women might not join processions. You can see an urban procession being watched by women there, but they do come out to watch them. They might wear concealing garments, but this varied according to class. And as we can see here, they can be seen at shrines, at bazaars. Top right is a shrine, top left is a bazaar, bottom left or middle left is women out on an event buying water from the water cellar. On the right, women assembling on the way to a religious event. So we can see, therefore, that women are in space, and beyond that in urban space, and they were in rural space as well. I could have put together a similar story about rural space. Women might not join processions, as I said, but there were situations when women did take to the streets as protesters, whether alongside men or in female groups. And we have evidence from the 1940s onwards of that involvement, up to and including the famous nationwide, countrywide protest against the Shah's 1890 granting to a European the monopoly for trading tobacco, whose production was a major industry and whose consumption crossed classes and genders. Now, those protests had a religious dimension, And as with urban spaces, and this is what this next picture is illustrating, and I'm just about coming to the end, religious spaces can also be seen to have had complex gender dynamics. While the dominant structures of religious practice were certainly male-dominated, and some religious spaces like pulpits or madrasas, the centers of formal religious education, were inaccessible to women, more typical spatial practices, several of which are shown here, involved both men and women, but in differentiated ways. Thus, many of the rituals and ceremonies associated with the annual commemoration of Hussein, the founder martyr of the Shia Islamic tradition, brought men and women together in the same space, although, as you can see, distinctively grouped by gender. So there's a recitation going on at the top left, there's a drama going on at the top right, there is a ritual meal going on at the bottom right, and in the middle we actually see a woman religious professional, one of the professional reciters, who had all women versions of the recitations, like the one that Bibi Khanum organized, would be the one rehearsing the chants. Other Shia activities like pilgrimages to local shrines or sacred centers like Mashhad in eastern Iran and Karbala in Iraq were often undertaken by family or communal groups, although also, as has been mentioned, women going on pilgrimage could do so to separate themselves from family in search of autonomy. And visits to cemeteries, as you can see there, are another particularly female activity. Rather than seeing these as confused or inconsistent practices, we might consider that the uses and meanings of religious spaces expressed both religious discourses of difference, gender difference, and the embedding of religion in the life and outlook of communities across age and gender, and indeed class. The religious articulation of gendered social links, cultural norms and power relations was made manifest in these complex spatial forms. I hope that I have been able to open a conversation between the specifics of my work on 19th century Iran and the wider field of spatially aware women's and gender histories and of gendered spatial histories. My own thinking and research on 19th century Iranian experiences has been stimulated by reading and reflection on the wider field, which has enabled me to critique assumptions about gender separation in Iran, assuming that they're foundational and constitutive of the gender dynamics which Iranians made and lived in the 19th century. The effect of these critiques is not to dismiss the assumptions out of hand, but to establish nuanced and reflective ways to evaluate their relevance, to recognize their limitation, and deepen our understanding of the concepts involved. And these similar points apply to my thinking and writing about women's agency, about the mutual constitution of unequal power relations, and about intersectional approaches to the study of women and gender in 19th century Iran in its global and imperial setting, on which I could have said more. The invitation to present this piece has been an invaluable stimulus to develop my work in this way. And I give deep thanks to the Società Italiana delle Storiche and to your president, Raffaele Sarti, for giving me the opportunity. The inclusion of spatial elements in research, in analysis, and in writing enables historians of gender and women to better explore and understand past lives in every level and every form, from the most intimate and personal to the most global. At a time when our lived experiences and understandings of space in all those forms and levels are being changed and challenged by the global pandemic, it continues to be important to draw on and disseminate the knowledge, ideas, and insights which we gain from our study of past genders and women. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joanna, for your very interesting paper. And I would like now to open discussion. Dunque, grazie mille a Joanna. Chi volesse fare delle domande può scriverle nella chat domanda e risposta e quindi possiamo aprire la discussione. Vediamo se c'è qualcuno che vuole intervenire. I think that it's very interesting your analysis, and it's very helpful to challenge stereotypes about women and female segregation in Iran. In this sense, it seems to me that this you're thinking about space and gender and gendering space and spacing gender. It's really very, very useful. What do you think about, if I might ask, changing over time of what you are saying today? Because over time we have seen in Iran periods when segregation, you have challenged segregation, but nonetheless, if you look at picture of Iran, for instance, in the 60s and the 70s, you have the impression that segregation was less clear or was not that strong as in other period, even after a more recent period. So obviously it's interesting in that your challenge to this stereotype is very interesting, but my question is, do you see an evolution over time of the strength of these boundaries? Thank you.
That's a very helpful question, Raffaella. Of course, things change, although not in a linear way. So, for example, levels of government intervention in segregation practices has been up and down in the last century. And sometimes it's lateral. So the 60s, the 50s, 60s and 70s, particularly the 60s and 70s, certainly saw some desegregation of women's opportunities, but continued exclusion of women from quite a lot of work opportunities and also the maintenance of long established legal constraints, although there were a few reforms. You also get paradoxes. Since 1979, many people would think that maybe things have gone backwards, and we can give many examples of more attempts to maintain various kinds of gender segregation and to once again impose various kinds of gendered restrictions and inequalities. But on the other hand, there are more women in universities in Iran now than there ever were before. And in fact, they are slightly the majority of university students. So there are some important, it's often a question of movement in one area, but not so much movement in another. But also, I think, going to and fro. I mean, obviously, there's a longer answer, but maybe that gives you some sense of the issues. And I think one needs to unpack work issues. I'd recommend the work of Valentine Moghadam on work, who's done a lot of work on women and work, sort of in the modern period, sort of post 1960, I guess. Then I would think what one would think about sort of public opportunities and politics, women and culture. I mean, 20th century Iran saw an absolute flourishing of creative writing, for example, among women, which I know Anna Van Zan knew quite a lot about, for example, even though their opportunities were still, in other areas, were still quite limited. So I think it's about opening up, unpacking the story about did things improve or did they get worse?
Okay, thank you. Vorrei aggiungere che se qualcuno vuole fare delle domande in italiano, naturalmente le può fare. Io traduco, I'm going to translate very quickly my question and your answer. So in the meanwhile, perhaps someone else can ask his or her question. Joanna ha, nella sua presentazione, nella sua prolusione, ci ha mostrato come la segregazione spaziale in Iran nell'Ottocento non fosse così rigida come viene presentata in molte visioni stereotipate e naturalmente è cosa di grande interesse. D'altra parte la mia domanda verteva sul fatto se ci fosse nel corso del tempo una evoluzione nei, chiamiamoli, livelli o nelle caratteristiche della segregazione, in particolare se si pensa a quantomeno alle immagini che così superficialmente arrivano dall'Iran prima e dopo la rivoluzione di Khomeini, si ha l'impressione che ci sia stata un ritorno alla segregazione. Allora Joanna ha spiegato che ci sono state fasi diverse e che bisogna comunque spacchettare la questione e guardare i diversi ambiti. Per esempio nell'ambito dell'istruzione oggi all'università ci sono molte studentesse di sesso femminile, molte ragazze e ci sono anche molte docenti. La scrittura di cui si è molto occupata Anna Vanzana è stato anche un altro ambito di grande presenza, è stato ed è un ambito di grande presenza delle donne. Quindi ci sono sicuramente delle fasi, ma bisogna comunque anche diciamo così, andare a spacchettare appunto la questione e a analizzare le diversi ambiti. C'è qualche questione che si vuole, approfittando della presenza di Joanna, qualcuno vuole dire qualcosa? Se no ci avviciniamo anche un po' all'orario previsto. Our audience is not...
I actually tell you, while they're thinking, I'll show you my final image, which I didn't show you, which just leaves you with some questions.
Okay.
Oh, I'm having problems. Sorry, I can't quite do it.
You have to share the screen with the green.
I can share it like this. Okay.
Okay.
I like the idea of men stopping trying to educate women and educating themselves.
You do it over. Okay. Thank you. Maria, volevi fare una domanda?
No, volevo associarmi ai ringraziamenti per questa prolusione molto, molto intensa che sicuramente ci farà riflettere parecchio su questi temi.
Abbiamo una domanda, scusa, magari prima di andare verso... Susan Dalton, perhaps I can ask a question about how to square grand narratives with the perspective of individual case studies that allow scholars to access the richness and diversity of experience.
Okay, shall I answer?
Yeah.
I think there is a two-way relationship between what we might call microhistories, and there's a rich scholarship, of course, on the uses of microhistories, which many people at this conference will know better than I think going back to the work of people like Carlo Ginzburg. But I think that for me, as I work in the archives or as I read a text from the 19th century, you start hearing these individual stories, and I chose the two stories that I brought to you today, and you want to make sense of them. But what I do to make sense of them is to bring my reading as a historian and my thinking as a historian about the bigger picture. But then I would argue that the stories I told you are a way to improve the bigger picture, but that the bigger picture is the resource we use to understand the material that we encounter, the material from the past. So for me, it's an interactive relationship.
Okay, thank you. Altre, prego, Marina, ti ho interrotta, scusa, ma avevo visto che era arrivata una domanda. Se ci sono altre domande, prego. Marina, se vuoi riprendere la parola.
La mia non era una domanda, erano dei ringraziamenti, quindi se vuoi tradurre brevemente sì, questa risposta, ti ringrazio. Sì,
prego. No, ok. Marina only wanted to thank you for your presentation. E cosa avevi detto, perché poi mi sono interrotta?
No, se potevi appunto riprendere un attimo la domanda di Susan Dalton e se volevi un attimino tradurla.
Ah, ok, scusatemi, la vado a recuperare. Allora, Susan Dalton chiedeva una domanda riguardo a come, diciamo così, mettere insieme le grandi narrazioni con una prospettiva di casi individuali che permetta agli studiosi di cogliere la varietà e la diversità, la ricchezza delle diverse esperienze. Joanna ha risposto appunto ricordando che sono due aspetti, due livelli di analisi che non possono essere, che dal suo punto di vista non possono appunto essere separati, vanno tenuti insieme sostanzialmente. Ok.
So can I say how wonderful it was for me to develop my thoughts because you gave me the invitation. I really mean that.
Yeah.
So this has been wonderful, and I'm looking forward to coming to some of the sessions for the rest of the conference.
Okay,
You've got a wonderful program, and some of it I will be able to follow.
Ok, allora Joanna dice ci ringrazia per il fatto che l'abbiamo stimolata a riflettere su questi temi e quindi dice che continuerà poi a seguire il convegno, alcune pani del convegno nei prossimi giorni. Da questo punto di vista, as you have seen in the program, we will have also some panel in English. Not all the panel are in Italian, so there is an opportunity also for English-speaking people to follow some parts, at least, of our conference. So, Joanna, thank you very much again for your presentation. From me and from the society, the board of the society, and all the association, and so see you probably also in the next day. There is also a thank from Maria Vittoria Palladin, who is the daughter of
yes,
Anna,
I saw
Anna
that message. It's good.
Okay. And thank you very much. Grazie a tutte e a tutti. A questo punto ci aggiorniamo a domani. Ricordo che ci sono i panel con sessioni parallele e che quindi ci si deve iscrivere c'è un link per ogni panel. Ogni panel rappresenta una stanza virtuale. Bene, grazie mille. Thanks
Buonasera.
again. Buonasera. Grazie mille.
Grazie, arrivederci.
Okay.